Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review a show called Rent, a Girlfriend. The first 5 episodes, ultimately, I don't know how well this is going to be received or believed or whichever. So, ultimately, at the end of the day, I just wanted to just go out of my way to just review these first 5 episodes, see what happens. Just kind of wing it. So, going into here, the thing that I like about this show in a very cryptic-like sense, reasonably, this show is broken down into me to think that this show is very simple and effective. It does have consistently those utter shock moments that people are just kind of stunned and just like, huh? What should I have to say next? What should I do next? I don't know. I'm just frozen in fear kind of moments. Really, this show honestly kind of reminds me of one. You can check out Nine Anime to go out of your way to check out this show. But two, you could also see a show called What the Hell Are You Doing Here, Teacher? I think that's approximately what the title is. I didn't come here with that entire title wrapped up into my head. I just immediately am just like, you know what, I should probably re-review that show after watching this. And hopefully I can find that through Nine Anime or some other source. I don't know, when looking at it, like the further on that I searched into Nine Anime, I was like, okay, like, it seems like there is a lesser variety of dubbed anime, so maybe I might adjust and find another app that might be further suited into finding more dubbed things, much more than probably Funimation that people have been going into and probably subscribing to. But anyways, so I would say that this show is very simple but yet effective. There are times where there are seemingly sex moments where uh, we ultimately have a main character called Kazuria. If I'm ill pronouncing that, I apologize. Kinoshita. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. Um, Anyways, uh, I would rather just call him Kinoshita the rest of the review. Maybe that's what I'll do. So Kinoshita ultimately is a character that seems to have been, and I know that's his last name. Kinoshita ultimately is a character that is in desperation. He's in desperation because ultimately his previous girlfriend had left him in the dust, and so ultimately we end up having it to where Kinoshita, out of desperation, is looking for a woman, and when looking at a woman, he's looking in the wrong places. He is looking in apps. He is looking in places where he can just rent a girl. So reasonably, after renting this girl, the further along that Kinoshita and this rent-a-girl ultimately have a relationship intertwined together, uh, which is I would call an arrangement more of a relationship. It's an arrangement. So the arrangement of which that they have goes into very much getting these characters way too intertwined in their personal and professional lives. Meaning that every single time there is this shock moment where both of these characters are kind of stunned in their tracks to just go like, oh, okay, well, what are we going to do now? Like, the secret has happened, the secret is up, and so on and so forth. We end up having it to where eventually it seems that these two characters, even though they are at a paid relationship, it seems that eventually the world is getting together to ultimately try to put these two legitimately together. So I just kind of find this show to be very interesting, where Like the stars are aligning for these people to have a real legitimate relationship, and like when these within these first 5 episodes, it really just kind of like it's really interesting how hard these characters are being pushed to be together, and as well as there are realistically some characters in here that are kind of really interesting to like add to the story. We seemingly have it to where there is a character called Mommy that, and it's not actually Kazuya's mommy. It seems that ultimately we have a character that ultimately is uh, Kinoshita's ex girlfriend that is named Mommy, and so this person will become a prominent character into these 5 episodes, as well as it seems that ultimately we'll have Kinoshita's grandmother seemingly part of the show. We'll have a kind of a barrage of kind of friends of Kazuya's that is kind of more and more just kind of like spending time with both Kinoshita and ultimately this rent a girl. And so, yeah, this show honestly to me was just kind of it was really simple. So maybe not everyone will like it, but at the end of the day, I don't know. I was just kind of watching it and I was like, you know what? Like I like how simple this is. It doesn't have to be like there's several animes that get so visually complicated and all kinds of like visual complications and all kinds of crazy things going on. I like how simple this show was. I like how simple it was and how it was just a interesting concept. And at the end of the day, that's all we need to say. There is a lot of times where I think Kazuya ultimately has a lot of fantasies that go along in his mind, which ultimately dip into the SEX kind of territory, where it seems that Kinoshita ultimately is a person that ultimately has never really been with a woman, seemingly, or barely been with a woman. So ultimately, we have it to where this guy is just like you basically have a like a slight breeze down there, if you know what I mean. Ultimately, this guy is going to be pinching a tent for days. Like that's what this character is. It's just like this guy consistently has fantasies going on in his mind about women, and how we end up having it to where it seems that we have it to where Kinoshita ultimately is seemingly easily stimulated, let's just say, by a photo or by a thought of his mind. And so we end up having Kinoshita at some points giving himself a beef jerkin, if you know what I mean, a jerky herky, if you know what I mean, a big old shake, if you know what I mean, a big old tissue party, if you know what I mean. Anyways, so going on, we end up having it to where recently in the show that I think it's about that time to go into spoilers about these first 5 episodes. So again, this show is very simple. It might not be the most uh it might not be the most like going it might be slow to some people. So yeah, let's go into that double five to otherwise go into what is of course as per usual the spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So first 5 episodes. So in the very beginning of this episode, we have Kinoshita, who ultimately is going and seemingly just like he is in desperation. It seems that Mommy had left him, left him in the dust. We don't know exactly why within these first 5 episodes. We just kind of like at some point we have it where Mommy is also trying to humiliate Kinoshita when eventually she meets him again. And I think also we have it to where uh, recently it seems that Mommy is trying to really just get under the skin of Kinoshita and really just like hurt this man, really. So going on into here, so we end up having it to where Kinoshita is in desperation mode, and ultimately he's looking at any way to get a girlfriend humanly possible. So he ends up going and finding apps that are to otherwise rent a girlfriend. And so we end up finding a girl called Chizuri Ichinos. Ichinos? I'm ill pronouncing that, I'm sure. Chizuri. We'll call her Chizuri. So we end up having Kinoshita and Chizuri seemingly going on a date every Wednesday. It seems that the very first date that both of them end up going on is to have this girl being presented to Kinoshita's grandmother. So, because bizarrely, it seems that eventually this grandmother ultimately wants Kinoshita to have some girlfriend, and ultimately it seems that he is a grandma's boy, and so ultimately, like, he's doing anything to please his grandmother, and this girl is it. So we end up having both of these couple. We end up having both of these people going on into here and going to this old folks' home. We end up finding out that it seems like Chizuri and Kinoshita, it seems that ultimately we find out that Chizuri's grandmother is also in this exact same old folks' home. And we ultimately have it to where Kinoshita's grandmother is ultimately going to all the other elderly to have them come in here to see, like, hey, look at my grandson who has a girlfriend. Come and look. And so ultimately, Chizuri and Kinoshita is freaking out because they're worried that ultimately the one grandmother that is going to be brought in there is Chizuri's grandmother, and ultimately considering they are to be like not having a real relationship. This is all fabricated and fake or whatever. Ultimately, we have it to where every single thing really comes down to Chizuri is going to have her personal life be affected uh, by this job. Like, it's coincidental. I'm going to pause here for a second. All right. So we end up having our character go in and commingle uh, with Kinoshita's. So we have Chizuri commingle with Kinoshita's grandmother, and that leads them to otherwise have Chizuri be frightened that her grandmother might show up and ultimately see both of them together. So both of them end up trying to escape this elderly old folks' home by just hiding under a bed sheet and hoping that no one will see them. Eventually, we have it to where, of course, Kinoshita's grandmother ends up like finding them, but ultimately they play it off and they play it as if it's just some old lady who's sleeping. So we end up having it to where ultimately they we push on to ultimately have them eventually decide to leave. Because when looking at it, it's like, yeah, like, this was like a close call to them. Eventually, more and more we'll get it to be the fact that this relationship, the more we go on, is just going to consistently be like a consistent like wrench in the gears. Like later on, we eventually have it to where Chizuri and Kinoshita supposedly they're both of their grandmothers are getting out of this old folks home at the exact same day. Um, like I don't know if it's an folks home or it's a hospital or whatever, but it is what it is. So eventually, that's when both grandmothers will meet and ultimately will say, "Oh, hey, that's the girlfriend that you're dating. Oh, well, that's my grandmother or that's my granddaughter," and so on and so forth. So ultimately, the thing that they were voting here ultimately will come back to bite them later on. So reasonably, I'm kind of doing all 1 through 5 of these episodes kind of like mixed in together. But anyways, so we move on. We eventually have it to where seemingly that we find out that Chizuri and Kinoshita ultimately, of course, are of course the same age, and we end up finding out that both of them are going to school, and coincidentally, they end up going and are going to the exact same school. But we eventually find out that Chizuri ultimately is a person that looks a little bit different than she does as a rent-a-girlfriend. She's wearing glasses. Like it kind of seems like she's pulling the whole like Clark Kent Superman thing going on within Chizuri. Hilariously enough, when you have it to where Shizuri is either with glasses or without glasses, it seems that people can't tell the difference, but Kinoshita can. It seems like I guess like you putting her in two different kind of personalities, or two different kind of personas, and none of her friends can tell. None of Kinoshita's friends could tell the difference, but Kinoshita, which I thought was hilarious. So going in here, so we end up finding that both of these people are going to the same school. So we end up having it toward Chizuri and Kinoshita ultimately have to have a talk out to just say like, hey, like I'm a stranger to you. Like we're gonna keep on dating and whatever, and paid dating and whatever, and but like you and me, strangers. Like we've never heard of one another, and so on and so forth. Um, and so like it seems more and more that these characters are getting compacted to ultimately be consistently around one another. But I guess it's also very convenient when they're going to have these like kind of transaction of sorts and this and that. We eventually have it to where Chizuri ultimately at some points ultimately kind of helps Kinoshita ultimately try at some points in time to be more confident about himself. We also have it to where Chizuri ultimately is to kind of tell him about like kind of what their like what is to go on, like pay her before, so that way ultimately they don't have to kind of like finagle and whatever about the pay and the payments afterwards. So moving on. So we have it to where ultimately Kinoshita and Chizuri ultimately as the Superman persona, let's just say. She's not a superhero, it's just the two different personas. So we end up having it to where they are going out on a date, and we end up having it to where ultimately it seems that they bump into classmates. We end up having it to where Yoshi Kair or Kaiki Kinoshita's best friend, like basically almost his brother, but his best friend. So we end up having it to where Kinoshita and his friends, let's just say, ultimately go and are noticing Kinoshita and his new girl, and they're ultimately just like, "Oh my god, this girl is a knockout!" Like, dude, there's no way that like you should have sex with this girl without like cementing that you're boyfriend and girlfriend and everything like that. You like basically like pretty much marry this girl because like make sure you like you because if you don't and this girl dumps you, like this girl is gonna ruin you forever. And so it's kind of really nice that ultimately they're talking up this girl so much. So we end up having it to where ultimately Kinoshita's friends ultimately ask him to go out to dinner, and so ultimately they say, "Well, hey, why not? Like, it's a date, so F it, why not just go?" They end up going, and we end up finding out that mommy is there at that same establishment, and we end up finding out that ultimately Kinoshita's friend is ultimately just like, dude, I didn't know she was gonna be here. Like, I guess let's just sit by her because it's gonna be awkward as f, but let's just make the best of it. So we end up having it to where ultimately, so Kinoshita and his friends are sitting at this diner or this establishment, and we eventually have it to where mommy goes into this long stretch of dialogue where she is talking about how unbelievably much of a horn dog that Kinoshita is. Basically, mentioning how there was a struggle to basically get them to figure out a place where ultimately they could have sex. And I say these things the way I do just because of YouTube and its great way of just me trying to dodge or avoid how to say things because you always have to say things cryptically or else you want to get warnings or garbagey things that ultimately make no sense. So I just tend to avoid it so that way I can censor myself and so on and so forth. So we have mommy who is ending up mentioning how furlong of a horn dog that ultimately Kinoshita is. It seems that ultimately they couldn't get to her place to be able to do the bedroom business, so they end up having it to where Kinoshita ultimately offers to go to his place, where it seems that his place was much more unclean than her place was, but he was just desperately trying to get into her pants and ultimately trying to get her to be anywhere where they could just get into some bedroom business. Mommy ultimately like starts this whole dialogue of how Kinoshita was to his friends, kind of humiliating them, kind of like shaming them, and I guess maybe this was some kind of way of getting to see what Kinoshita would do, or ultimately what Kinoshita's girlfriend would do. We end up having it to where Chizuri ends up just smacking onto the table, and she ends up going and talking crap, talking smack or whatever to mommy, and then we end up having it to where Kinoshita ends up going and defending his ex-girlfriend. Defending his ex-girlfriend. Dude, you could have like never seen this girl again in the rest of your life. But we end up having to where Kinoshita defends his ex-girlfriend of him basically being okay that he said all being okay that Mommy had said all this stuff, and we end up having it to where Chizuri ends up leaving in utter disgust. We end up having it to where Kinoshita eventually falls after her, and we end up having it to where Mommy ends up going and finding Kinoshita and is like, oh, well, hey, like, it's great that you went to my defense on this thing because ultimately, like, I can't believe that this girl said all these things and so on and so forth. It seems like Mommy and Kinoshita had gotten, I guess, like, she wanted to see what Kinoshita would do because really I think she is still immediately trying to say that it's like, oh dude, I have this guy around my finger kind of thing. So pushing on, so we eventually have it to where it seems that Kinoshita is kind of consistently getting to be with Mommy. It seems that at some point that eventually we have it to her again. Mommy's putting it in a situation with Kinoshita to ultimately go and like sleep with him, but it seems that that doesn't exactly work out. It seems that again we have it to where they go to his place and or he's going to offer to go to his place again, and reasonably we end up finding out that that is just not going to work out, and so we end up having it to where Kinoshita just gives himself a big old handshake down below, if you know what I mean, and ultimately fantasizing about Mommy. We eventually have it to where at some point we interject at some point to have Chizuri ultimately also in that fantasy at some point, because eventually the more and more he spends time with her, the more and more that it seems that uh, Chizuri means as much to him as Mommy did. So we end up having it to where Kinoshita goes along and still dates Chizuri. Chizuri ends up at some point saying that Kinoshita is faithful, but he's also going and stealing a kiss with Mommy at some point. And eventually it seems that ultimately when they go out to a beach and have a beach adventure, it seems that ultimately they go out and eventually Kinoshita and Mommy are Mommy is of course having a bathing suit on, so ultimately Kinoshita is like, ooh ah. So we end up having it to ultimately like Kinoshita and Mommy are of course making out. And that's when ultimately Chizuri is saying like, oh, I'm sure he's faithful. Yeah, sure he is. It also is kind of funny when eventually we have Chizuri as her Clark Kent persona in her glasses. You ultimately have it to where nobody knows who Chizuri is, and eventually when these guys are out kind of just walking along on this beach, we eventually bump into Chizuri, and ultimately we have it to where their friends introduce her, and they ultimately ask Kinoshita if they've met before, if the Clark Kent persona of Chizuri and him have met before, and ultimately Kinoshita said, "Well, and Chizuri's like, no, we haven't." It's just kind of cementing that it's like, yeah, remember, I'm a stranger to you, and ultimately they don't know, they can't tell the difference. So and we have to where Kinoshita is like, how could they not tell the difference? How could they not? Which I thought was hilarious. So, going on into here, so reasonably, that's kind of the meat and the potatoes of what is really to go on within here. But let me get something out. So we also have it to where seemingly that uh, that even Kinoshita's best friend, which is I'm gonna call him uh, Yoshai Yoshai Yoshi Yoshiki 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 Yoshiki. Sure. So Yoshiki, I'm probably ill pronouncing that, and I apologize. Um, he ultimately is to basically go and talk to Chizuri, basically begging her to always be Kinoshita's girlfriend. Like, basically, like saying like he's a really great guy and like he's my best friend and like all this, like this guy is buttering her up to the ceiling, told me say like this guy is going to treat you good and everything like that. And so we end up having it to where Kinoshita is ultimately going and he's in the bushes hearing all of this, not realizing it. uh, and so this guy is like begging and pleading for her to always be with his best friend because it's like, hey, he'll treat you good and whatever. And so we end up having it to where it seems that his best friend had given them this these boat tickets, God, what is it called? Like ferry tickets? Yeah, there we go. Like ferry tickets. Ferries are ultimately like boats that ultimately kind of like travel from point to point and whatever. Um, Ferries. So ultimately, we have it to where seemingly that uh, Kinoshita and Chizuri ultimately go onto this ferry, and we end up finding out that Chizuri it must be like really seasick or something along those lines because she was like, ugh. Like she starts like going like, ugh. Like she is just like, ugh. She's so we end up having it to where Chizuri is like. We end up having it to where Kinoshita is ultimately going to Chizuri and he's like, "Are you okay? Like you're looking a little green. You're looking a little green there, girl." So we end up finding out that seemingly that this girl is just like, well, we have to do this ferry because like your best friend would have wanted this, and so like ultimately let's just do this and get it over with, and eventually we'll break up after this, or what is the equivalent of breaking up for a paid relationship. Um, so we go into here and we end up finding out that uh, that uh, Chizuri is ultimately mentioning at some point in time in these 5 episodes um, that she's mentioning to Kinoshita that she could quite possibly give him a goodbye and a hello, which ultimately Kinoshita is like, what the heck does that mean? Like, what is like what exactly like so is she quite possibly saying that like yeah they do have a business relationship but they could also have a actual relationship because ultimately at points in time like yeah she could be his paid girlfriend but also she could just also be his legitimate girlfriend, who knows. So we ultimately have it to where like Kinoshita is all really all good and confused with uh, Chizuri because we end up having it to where at some point where even Kinoshita and Chizuri is ultimately in a bathroom and Kinoshita is ultimately asking Chizuri if she's jealous, just kind of really confirming things. So back to the ferry. So we end up having it to where eventually that Chizuri is getting so seasick, and Chizuri is ultimately telling Kinoshita that, like, hey, well, after this, like, after we supposedly break up, like, you can go and go back with mommy and be with mommy. Because ultimately it seems that like you're really still hung up on this girl. And so after this relationship is over, it seems like this is the jealousy point that because ultimately at some point we have it to where it seems that mommy wanted to hang out with Kinoshita. It seems that ultimately she called him and wanted to be with him, but ultimately Kinoshita was at this ferry, and so ultimately he's like, "Well, hey, like I'll make my way to you," but eventually we end up finding out that or Chizuri ends up getting so seasick that she ends up falling out of the boat, and we end up having a tour. Kinoshita ends up jumping after her into the water and dragging her out of the water to perform CPR and to get her back to health, and ultimately he does. There is also, even at some point within these 5 episodes, that eventually they end up having to share a room together, which I thought was really funny. We end up having Chizuri and Kinoshita ending up like just spending a night with one another, and we have it to where Kinoshita was ultimately going to sleep in the bathroom, and ultimately Chizuri's like, "Dude, no, you can sleep in this room." So we end up having it to where they both like sleep in the room and nothing happens. Um, but it's just the fact that it's ultimately just like there's so many times where this relationship between these two have to get so absurdly close, and like there's so many times where ultimately like things could have accidentally happened or whatever. But yeah, so that so far in a nutshell is these first 5 episodes. So ultimately at the end of the day, you could see ultimately if you are interested with this show, or ultimately you could go without it. Again, I thought that the story was so interesting and just kind of like shock value moments, but really tearing it all down, it's just a simple but interesting show. And so I think that's all I wanted to say about these first 5 episodes. I apologize if there wasn't much more heavier in detail about these 5 episodes, and probably there were some points where I kind of jumbled around a little bit. But anyways, I think that kind of covers most of these first 5 episodes. So with that, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.